So I'm going to go ahead and welcome you to our program. My name is Angie Grove. I'm the director here at the Ethan Allen Homestead Museum. We are a nonprofit museum that does not receive federal or state funding, which might be a good thing right now. But that does mean that I'm constantly soliciting you for your support. So this is that message once again. We do have memberships available after this program. If you would like to purchase an annual membership to our nonprofit museum, you could do so at the front desk, and Allie will help you out there. We have individual memberships, household memberships called the Homestead membership as well. And we are kicking off our annual fundraising drive. So those of you who are on our mailing lists, you should expect something in the mail very soon. And if you're not on our mailing list and you would like to be, so you can show your support every year to the Homestead here, please catch me on your way out the door and I can get your mailing list and add you to that. And if you're not on our email list, there's a sign-up sheet at the entrance here, so you can add your email there as well. And then lastly, there's a beautiful donation box right by the exit door. So there's lots of ways to give and support the Homestead, and we really appreciate your support. Okay, I also want to thank our supporters of this program. Richard and Linda Smarg are generous supporters of our lecture series program, so thank you them for helping. Thanks. Okay, on to the announcements about our upcoming events. This is our last lecture of the calendar year, so we do not do one in December. So please don't try to come in December. It'll be cold and dark in the building. However, the grounds around here are beautiful and they're open year-round, dawn to dusk, and it's a great cross-country ski area and snowshoe area. If you haven't been, I recommend it. And then please come back to join us. Here are the dates. And I mostly say this so that it gets recorded in the film so people can write it down when they watch the recording. The next year's lecture series is January 18th, February 15th, March 15th, April 19th. That'll get us through the winter season before we open again in May and continue then. Next year, 2026, is the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence and the official anniversary date of the United States of America. And so all of our programs, all of our lectures next year will all be focused on Revolutionary War and the legacy of the Revolutionary War related topics. Okay. So with that, I am now going to introduce the person who will introduce the speaker. She is a board member here at the museum, a history professor at St. Michael's College, and was recently announced, tell me the official title, but our governor recently endowed her with the title of the official Vermont historian of the American Revolution for the 250th anniversary. Yes, Dr. Alexandra Garrett.
Awesome. Thank you, Angie. Yeah, so every colony turned state that exists in the United States today has a state commission headed by its governor that has, it's organizing events for the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution next year. So yeah, I'm the Revolutionary War historian for Vermont, but there'll be a Revolutionary War historian for Massachusetts, for Rhode Island. So just if that interests you, you can look up each state's website to look that information up. Cool. So again, I'm Dr. Alexandra Garrett, and I'm an assistant professor in the history program at St. Michael's College. And I'm really excited to introduce our speaker today because if I had joined St. Michael's a little earlier, or if he had stayed on at St. Michael's a little later, then our paths would have crossed as colleagues. But instead, we're friends and get to meet each other and kind of interact at the different holiday parties that the St. Michael's history program has. So I've really enjoyed getting to know Doug, even though technically we never worked together, right? So this is Dr. Doug Slaybaugh. He is a professor of history emeritus at St. Michael's College in Colchester, where he taught United States history for 32 years. His favorite courses to teach were on the history of presidential elections and on the evolution of the American dream. He has also taught at Cornell, Texas Tech, Ithaca College, SUNY Cortland, and Wells College. He holds a BS and MA from Iowa State and a PhD from Cornell, all in history. He is author of the book William Myers and the Modernization of American Agriculture. And he's also the author of articles on social work in the Progressive Era, federal farm policy in the Great Depression, Adlai Stevenson's presidential campaigns in the 1950s, and the closing of the Winooski Woolen Mills. So he really is a polymath here in history, and we're really excited to have him speak today on how Vermont became iconic. So everyone, please welcome Dr. Doug Slaybaugh.
Well, thank you for coming out. I didn't know if many people would want to brave the potential snowstorm, but it looks like maybe it's holding off a little bit today. I'm going to try to avoid having too many senior moments while I'm talking, forgetting things, but you can help me out in case that happens. I wanted to mention before I get started that I am going to talk a little bit about suicide in this presentation, just so you're aware of that. Now, as Alexi said, I came to Vermont some time ago. It was in 1986, to be exact. But I had been in Vermont before that. In fact, the summer of 1967, I had been a college intern in Baltimore, working for the City Civil Rights Commission. It's called the Community Relations Commission. Very interesting experience. But I'd spent the summer there, and then I had an opportunity to go up to Williamstown, Massachusetts, late in August, to stay with a friend's family. And on that trip, we drove up Route 7 into Vermont. I remember going through Bennington and points north, and then we got off on little rural byways, and I'd never been in Vermont before, and after the sort of grit and noise and the diesel fumes of Baltimore, it was really quite a wonderful contrast to be in Vermont. It reminded me a little bit of where I grew up. I'm originally from Iowa. I grew up in a small town, agricultural. I worked on farms when I was growing up. And, Vermont reminded me a little bit of that, the small towns, farms. But Vermont was much more beautiful. It was so green. It was so lush. And I think I began to hatch the idea that maybe I might want to come back here. Maybe I might want to live here. And it took me almost 20 years, but I eventually was able to do that. And I've been here ever since and really don't plan on leaving. Now, how Vermont became iconic. I don't know if you think of Vermont as being iconic, but that's the theme I'm going to talk about. If you've been in Vermont all your lives, maybe you take it for granted. Maybe it doesn't seem so special. But I do have the perspective of somebody who comes in as a flatlander, an outsider, and maybe that makes it more special to me. But I think there are reasons to think of Vermont as a very special place, and that's kind of what I want to talk about today. It wasn't always special. That's how we're going to get started, thinking about Vermont as a place that people didn't want to be in particularly. It wasn't an inviting place.
Bowling in his grave.
Yeah. Oh, well. Our whole goal here is to kind of undermine Ethan's legend, isn't it? So I'm helping to do that. So anyway, we're going to begin in 1900. And our focus today really is going to be on the 20th century, roughly 1900 to 2000. I will be saying some things about the 19th century and at the end maybe a little bit about more recent times. But we'll start around 1900. I wanted to show these population statistics. This is from the U.S. Census in 1900, actually, to show how Vermont compares with the other New England states. We often compare Vermont with these states. And I think in the relative position of these states in terms of population is still roughly the same. They've obviously grown. Vermont was in last place. Vermont was the smallest. What was maybe particularly interesting about this fact then was that Vermont basically wasn't growing. They'd barely grown since the middle of the 19th century. And in fact, in the decade of 1910 to 1920, Vermont actually lost population. I think that's the only decade in Vermont's history where that happened. Young people were leaving. There didn't seem to be a lot of opportunities. The great fear, and not just for Vermonters, but I think for probably a majority of Americans, was that if you got sick, you couldn't work, you couldn't pay your bills, you're going to end up in a place like is pictured here. This is a Vermont poor farm. You might be familiar with poor farms. There are poor farm roads all over the place, but there were really actually existing buildings that were poor farms, and they had grounds, and often the residents there had to work to, like raise food for themselves. Poor farms were intended for people who couldn't support themselves, basically. So old they couldn't work anymore. Maybe unmarried women with young children might end up there. Somebody with a severe disability might end up there. But it was not a happy place. You tended to look down on these people. There was always the kind of lingering feeling among most people who are not in the poor farms that maybe you deserved to be there. Maybe God was punishing you. Maybe you were somebody who didn't want to work. You were lazy. It was like the worst possible place that you could imagine ending up. And I think for a lot of Vermonters, even though the great majority, of course, never ended up in the poor farm, there was a fear that they were close to that. They were just scraping by. They were just managing, but just barely. People were leaving Vermont. All kinds of people. I wanted to show you a few of the more famous ones who were leaving Vermont. If we take a look at the man who's pictured on the upper left, does anybody know who this is?
Stevens? Thaddeus?
No. He was born in Rutland in 1804. As a teenager, he moved up to Middlebury.
John Deere.
It's John Deere. He, was a blacksmith. He decides he's going to move out west where there might be more opportunities. He ends up in Moline, Illinois, on the banks of the Mississippi, and of course, he starts his famous farm implement company. What about the man next to him in the middle?
Joseph Smith,
Joseph Smith. What do you know about Joseph Smith?
the prophet of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
Okay.
Born in Sharon.
Born in Sharon, 1805. The Mormons actually operate a little museum down there, which is really kind of an interesting place to go to. I would recommend that you do that if you have an opportunity. The reason we don't have a photograph of him is he was murdered in the 1840s. Mormons were always a controversial sect, certainly in the 19th century, and more so once they adopted polygamy. Smith would be killed in a little place called Nauvoo, Illinois. I remember going there as a teenager. And fortunately for the Mormons, his lieutenant, Brigham Young, was there to take over the movement and lead Mormons out to the wilds of Utah. Brigham Young, by the way, was also born in Vermont. What about the man on the right in the upper row? Stephen Douglas. Stephen A. Douglas. Stephen A. Douglas was born in Brandon in 1811. And you might recall that he ends up going out to Illinois as well. He's a lawyer. He becomes a very well-known and successful lawyer there. He courts Mary Todd before Abraham Lincoln steals her away from Stephen A. Douglas. And of course, he challenges Lincoln politically. In the 1850s, Douglas was one of the most powerful politicians in the country. What about the guy pictured on the lower left? Okay, Chester Arthur. You do know something about Vermont history. Born in Fairfield, 1829. lived in Heinsberg for a time as a child. One of my former colleagues in the history department at St. Michael's lives in the house next to where Arthur lived as a child.
They love to argue that it was actually born in Canada.
Yeah, there are rumors. It sounds like something the Democrats would have put together to try to keep him from ever becoming president. But he moves to New York, becomes a leading figure in the Republican Party there, rises to the vice presidency, and when Garfield was assassinated, he becomes president. And I guess I don't have to ask you who this remaining figure is. You can't be a real Vermonter unless you know Calvin Coolidge. Born July 4th, 1872, Plymouth Notch. Also rises to the presidency because the president dies and he was vice president. So these are prominent people who left Vermont. But the thing to remember is that they're all kinds of ordinary Vermonters who are also leaving. You know, if you come from a big farming family and you're one of the younger sons, you know, there's no land for you to get hold of when you come of age. You're probably going to go west and look for other land to farm, or go to a city and look for some other kind of opportunity. There just aren't enough opportunities within the state. Now, the next few slides, I'm going to talk a bit about what I'm calling bellwether industries in the 19th and early parts of the 20th century that Vermonters depended upon for jobs. And these are all basically in decline, certainly by the time we get to the 20th century. There's logging, for instance. Logging has always taken place in Vermont, but it was really a huge industry, certainly before the 1870s. Burlington, in fact, was considered to be the third leading timber port in the whole country. The forests of Vermont were being clear-cut. The wood was being processed and brought down to the Burlington waterfront. You know, the beautiful waterfront park you probably are familiar with. 30 yards of it was simply stacks of lumber, sitting there ready to be put on ships where it could be taken up to Montreal or down to New York City via Lake Champlain. By the time we get to 1900, Vermont has lost most of its forests. So it's not exactly a very pretty place. But beyond just the look of Vermont, there's also a lot of environmental degradation going on. I wanted to mention that when they're clear-cutting these forests, there was one kind of tree that they spared. Can you guess which one it was?
Maple.
Sugar maple, of course. And one of the reasons that we have such spectacular leaf peeping seasons is from all those sugar maples that have propagated themselves. And it's the sugar maples that have the brilliant reds, yellows, and orange colors that we enjoy so much. Just to pick up on the kind of environmental damage that was going on. On hillsides, mountainsides, the roots of trees are critical to hold the soil in place. And when those trees are gone and you have rain, the rain is going to wash down the hillsides and it's going to wash away soil. It's also going to contribute to the worsening of floods that can happen. It's also lowering farm productivity. Vermont doesn't have a lot of high quality soil. Where I grew up in Iowa, when the first Europeans arrived in the 1840s, in places the topsoil was 16 feet deep, some of the richest soil in the world. Today, a lot of it's down in the Mississippi Delta. But, I mean, it was quite a place to have agriculture. And Vermont farmers are having to compete with places like that in producing their crops. So farm productivity in Vermont, and difficult as it was to farm, it's going down. It's also destroying habitat for birds and other wildlife and fish. Well, farming was under stress just from this environmental damage. But farming had been in a long decline. probably the peak of farming in Vermont was before the Civil War. From around 1810 to 1840, there was a craze for wool for merino sheep. Merino sheep originally came from Spain. They have a very fine, silky kind of wool that was greatly in demand, not just in the United States, but in Europe and other places. And Vermonters really kind of led the way in producing these sheep. If you go down to, what's the museum? Rokeby. You can still see some of the buildings that were used to care for these merino sheep. Eventually, of course, farmers in other parts of the country, they want in on the merino sheep demand, and they start producing them, and Vermonters can't compete. But when they did, Addison County actually had more sheep being produced than any other county in the United States for a time. But ultimately, Vermont farmers simply are not going to be able to compete. The topography is difficult to farm. The soil is rocky. There's not a lot of topsoil in most parts of the state. And so what we see happening by the end of the 19th century is a shift to dairy farming. This is happening all over the country, by the way, as different regions are beginning to specialize. You're moving beyond a kind of subsistence farming, and you're focusing on a crop or an animal or a product that you have some advantages in producing. And, it's relatively easy to grow hay, harder to grow row crops, but you can grow hay, you can feed it to milk cattle, and you can produce milk products. So that's what Vermonters are trying to do. But steadily, more and more farmers are selling out, going out of business. And that continues right up until the present day. One of the disadvantages of farming in Vermont is the rocky soil. But, some of those rocks have a value. There's stone that you can take out of the ground, and people want it. Vermont marble was certainly something that was very much in demand. In fact, Rutland County, during much of the 19th century, was producing more marble than anywhere else in the United States. And it was being used to make a lot of important public buildings. Rutland County, and in particular Proctor, is where most of this marble was being quarried. Redfield Proctor, who founded the company, very prominent Vermonter, governor, senator, Secretary of War at one time. He was Secretary of War when they created 40th and Allen over in Colchester and Essex Junction. Marble kind of peaked in demand around the time of World War I, used for gravestones, for war memorials, that kind of thing. But by the 1920s, the demand for marble is dropping, and people are more interested in granite, which, of course, for Vermont, it's helpful that, the great granite producing area is around Barre. So Barre really is coming into its own about this time, and Vermont granite is being used in a lot of important buildings. And I've mentioned a couple of things where it was used. After World War II, though, the demand for granite or other kinds of building stone really begins to drop off. People are looking to build taller buildings, even skyscrapers. Now, you can't really use stone to build, like a 100-story building. The engineering problems of doing that are just overwhelming. You have to use steel and concrete, and that's what modern buildings tend to be built of. You can, the lower floors, you might be able to get away with using stone, but otherwise, it's not going to work very well. Another important industry was textile manufacturing. And all the northeastern states at one time had a textile industry. This was like the original industry in many other places, going back even to before the American Revolution, but certainly enduring for some time. textile production in places like the Burlington Cotton Mill and the Winooski Woolen Mill began around the time of the Civil War or just before that. Production would peak during World War II. Burlington Woolen Mill, for instance, was producing a lot of the uniforms for the American military. But when the war ended and government contracts ended, demand dropped. The mills were no longer particularly profitable. Mill owners were concerned about the costs of running these mills, particularly in the winter when heating costs were high. The fact that there were unions here trying to represent the workers was also something the management wanted to avoid. And so beginning in the 1850s, most of these mills end up going to the southern states, and eventually, of course, they go abroad. One of the downsides of these mills, I wanted to show you with this particular photograph. This is a picture of a little girl working in the Winooski Woolen Mill. It was taken by the great muckraking photojournalist Lewis Hine. Lewis Hine was very interested in documenting the way children were used to work in these very demanding jobs in coal mines and factories. He had to sneak into the woolen mill to take this and a few other pictures. He wanted to show, what these children were dealing with. And children in a mill like this were in demand because, if the works got jammed up, these little kids with their skinny arms and little hands could reach in there and get stuff unstuck. Of course, it was very dangerous. You could end up losing a hand or even an arm, perhaps. And we need to keep in mind that even if they were going to school, they probably weren't in a great condition to get a lot out of the education that was being offered to them. Which leads to saying a little bit about education in Vermont by the early 20th century. We're nostalgic about the old one-room schoolhouse, and I'm nostalgic about it. My parents both went to one-room schoolhouses. My grandmother taught in one into the 1950s. But it's not the greatest place to get an education. It's what people had. It's what they thought they could afford. I don't want you to get the impression that Vermonters were anti-education, because they certainly were not. But, Vermonters tended to be very frugal. They didn't have a lot of money. They wanted to keep costs to a minimum. So one teacher for a small group of students in a single room, that was about what they thought they could manage. But Vermont had a history for many years of really barely funding their public schools. And it was similar for higher education. The University of Vermont has always been really right at the bottom of states supporting their state university, which is one reason that UVM is actually kind of a quasi-private institution. They're very dependent on private donations to keep operating. The state has chosen not to do any more than it has. They do more than they used to. But the upshot of all this is that Vermont has a population that's not particularly educated. They're educated maybe well for the early part of the 19th century. But as the economy becomes more sophisticated, and as the demand for workers who have more skills grows, Vermont's not really at the cutting edge. Why would you want to have a modern industry in Vermont if you can't find educated people to work in it? Now, as early as the 19th century, there was some talk of trying to revive the economy through tourism. 19th century, it was very popular for places that had mineral springs to create a spa, a resort where wealthy people could come and relax and take the waters. And, in this time before medicine was particularly advanced, this would be a way of treating all kinds of possible illnesses, rheumatism, for instance, migraines. most of these mineral springs kind of died out. They couldn't compete with mineral springs, say, in New Hampshire or the Adirondacks, which were better funded. They had more spectacular scenery. And so one of the few 19th century resorts that did persist was the one pictured here. This is Mount Philo. Some of you have probably been to Mount Philo. Mount Philo Inn at its foot is still there, operating, but I don't think they ever made a whole lot of money. But it's a beautiful place. If you haven't been there, I'd recommend that you do that. Now here's a man, I don't know if you're aware of him. He's essentially forgotten today, but he's somebody, if you're interested in Vermont, you should know something about Joseph Battelle. He was from Middlebury, from a wealthy family. He became a major philanthropist. His story was that when he was a student at Middlebury College, before the Civil War, he'd become very depressed for some reason, and he decided to take off a couple of days, and he rented a cabin in Ripton and just stayed there and just kind of took it easy. And the weather turned out to be very beautiful. It was summertime, it was warm, the birds were singing, there was a soft breeze blowing through the trees, and he felt like he was rejuvenated by this experience. And he had a kind of epiphany. He felt like, I've got this money. I'm going to use it to try to preserve as much of wild Vermont as I can. And that's exactly what he did. He would end up buying up much of the central spine of the Green Mountains to be used for conservation and recreation. He donated some of it to Middlebury. Breadloaf Mountain, the Snow Bowl came from him. Camel's Hump was donated to the state. A lot of this land ended up being key parts of the Vermont National Forest and also a place where the Long Trail could operate. I want to show you a quote from Battelle, which gives his philosophy. Here is a man who is committed to preserving natural Vermont, not just for himself, but for posterity. And we owe him a real debt if we're concerned with making Vermont remain the place that it is. Another important booster of Vermont, Dorothy Canfield Fisher. I've given you some facts here about her life. You might be aware that in the last few years, Dorothy Canfield Fisher was canceled. Are you aware of this story? There are allegations that she was a racist, a believer in eugenics. None of these stories have really been proven out. We do know that she was a champion of civil rights because she wrote articles in magazines promoting civil rights. She was well known for writing many books, particularly children's books. One of her most famous was a book called Understood Betsy, about an orphan girl who comes to Vermont. Most of her books would end up sort of championing Vermont and Vermont values and certainly encouraging people to get interested in Vermont. She's probably best known, though, for being one of the editors of the Book of the Month Club. I don't know if the Book of the Month Club still exists, but I remember having when I was a teenager, I think my family had a membership in it, and we would get books. And this is actually a very important way of spreading cultural literacy around the country. But for our purposes today, Dorothy Canfield Fisher is somebody who is championing economic development in Vermont. She had come back to the ancestral home in Arlington in 1907, which she'd inherited right after she was married, and really was a kind of tireless promoter of Vermont and reasons for people to come to Vermont and invest in Vermont. At one point, I think this was in the 1930s, she wrote a rather charming comic play called Tourists accommodated. It's about a farm family that has decided, you know, we need some extra money. What if we get some wealthy out-of-stater to come here and stay for a while, you know, and we'll turn our place into what we would think of as a kind of bed and breakfast. And they can see farm life and enjoy rural Vermont. And in the play, at first it seems like the farmers and the outsiders don't even speak the same language. They're kind of at cross purposes. They're unintentionally maybe irritating each other, but eventually they kind of come around and become more tolerant. And the point, of course, is to show that this could actually work. More farmers should do this kind of thing. And hopefully, you know, people from outside Vermont coming here would decide, you know, I kind of like this experience. Maybe I want to buy a second home, maybe a vacation home. Maybe I want to move to Vermont. But this is a way of introducing people to Vermont who had not really known much about it beforehand. Now, if you want to promote tourism, or at least get outsiders to come in to the state, of course, you've got to have a means for them to get here. And that was a huge problem. Vermont in the early 20th century barely had any paved roads. There were a few in places like Burlington or Rutland. But you go out in the country and you don't have any paving. You're lucky if it's graveled. Most of the roads are just dirt roads, and we all know what happens to dirt roads during much of the season. When it rains, you know, you get pictures like the one on the left. You know, you're not going to be encouraging tourists to get stuck in a mud hole. Vermonters, I think, originally were kind of skeptical of the automobile in general. And this is shown by a law that was passed by the state legislature in 1902, which mandated that if you were driving a motor vehicle on a road outside of a population center, you had to be preceded by a man on foot waving a red flag as a warning to oncoming horse-drawn conveyances, so the horses wouldn't be scared and maybe upset the wagon or whatever. Obviously, this law didn't stay on the books permanently, but it's a sign that, you know, Vermont was not exactly accommodating to modern technology and what the future might promise. The roads obviously were going to have to change before people were going to be encouraged to actually come into the state. And then there was a problem of flooding. Now, unfortunately, the last few years we've become all too aware of what it can be like in a town situated in a narrow river valley when there's heavy rainfall. You have disasters. In 1927, the state has a great disaster, which I think, you know, as terrible as the floods were recently, the 1927 flood may have been worse. The state was essentially cut off from the rest of the world for several weeks at a time. Hundreds of miles of bridges were washed out, including railroad bridges. Roads were undermined. The picture on the right, can anybody recognize where that was taken? It's not very far from here. The men in the picture are actually standing on the Burlington side of the river, but they're looking over toward the woolen mill. And that's exactly where the bridge is supposed to be. But of course, it's not there now. Eventually, they put up a pontoon bridge, and then later they build the bridge that we're still using. They've repaired it a lot. It's going to be replaced in the next couple of years. It really needs it, as if you've driven over it, you are well aware of that. Some people thought, well, maybe the silver lining of this flood and the fact that Vermont's going to have to really bend over backwards to try to rebuild its infrastructure was that the man sitting in the White House was a Vermonter, Calvin Coolidge. Surely Calvin Coolidge would take pity on Vermont and, you know, send some federal resources their way. They had done it in other parts of the country. The Mississippi River had a great flood at about the same time, and Herbert Hoover, who was the Commerce Secretary, had led an effort to help out states affected by that flood. But Calvin Coolidge made the decision that Vermonters were better than that. Vermonters were able to take care of themselves. In 1928, Coolidge was in Rutland, and he made a speech that has come to be known as the Brave Little State speech, in which he lauded Vermont as a place full of independent, self-reliant people who could help themselves. They could pull themselves up by their bootstraps. And so he didn't give them any money. He just gave them a pep talk, essentially. And so Vermont is kind of slow coming out of this flood and trying to get back on its feet. And that, of course, was the great question. Is Vermont going to be able to do it? Just a few years after the 1927 flood, the Great Depression descends on the country. America gets a President, Franklin Roosevelt, who's very ready to use federal government money to try to prop up the economy. He's particularly interested in building projects. One popular idea was to build skyway roads through scenic areas, and a number of them were built in the 1930s. Maybe the most famous is the one in the Blue Ridge Mountains. And some Vermonters are taken with this idea, the opportunity to get millions of dollars from the federal government to come in and build a road that basically would go across the spine of the Green Mountains. This would draw tourists. It would provide all these jobs in the construction. And there were powerful forces backing this idea. Dorothy Canfield Fisher is a proponent of this parkway. Burlington Free Press is supporting it. There are also powerful forces that were against the idea. The Lieutenant Governor, George Aiken, is against it. The Green Mountain Club, maybe for obvious reasons, don't want to have this highway in the very place where they're trying to put together the Long Trail. The argument was that the state just couldn't afford it. Even if the feds picked up much of the money, there was still going to be bills for Vermonters, and we might be in a place where we'd bankrupt the state trying to do something like this. Another element of the opposition was the idea that this is going to be bringing outsiders in, undesirable outsiders that we have to be careful about. They could change things. And I think part of this was anti-Semitic, this idea that Jews from big cities were going to come here and they'd be pushy and they'd be acting in stereotypical ways, and we don't want that. We don't want to build this infrastructure if people are going to come in here and change our state. And so the parkway, of course, was never built. Statewide referendum was held. Vermonters voted down the idea, and later the state legislature will vote against the idea as well. In our time, we might think, well, the obvious reason would have been the environmental damage, and that was mentioned to some extent. But it was the pros and cons of the effect on the economy that were probably the decisive issues. The Depression is going to be followed by World War II. And you may be familiar, I'm sure most of you are old enough that maybe you actually listened to it at the time, John Kennedy's inaugural address, full of many memorable phrases. One of them was this one about the torch being passed to a new generation. Certainly this includes Vermonters. Thousands and thousands of Vermonters had joined the military. They'd left their homes. They'd gone to new places in the United States. Many had gone abroad. They'd gained new perspectives on things. And a lot of them coming back get a sense that, maybe Vermont could be a little different than it has been. Maybe it could change in positive ways that would benefit us. And if we can get more education, maybe we can be part of this kind of change. One of the last great domestic programs of Franklin Roosevelt was the passage of what we call the GI Bill in 1944. This is going to provide government money so that veterans coming back can get higher education, or they can go to a trade school, gain skills that can be used in improving their lives and making more money and being a more productive member of the community. Colleges in Vermont certainly are affected by this. UVM, St. Michael's. I know more about St. Michael's from teaching there, but in the late 1940s, a lot of temporary housing that had been put up at what's now Camp Johnson was dismantled, taken down Route 15 a mile to the St. Michael's campus, and reassembled into what was called Maketown. This was housing for these veterans, and in some cases they were married, so they were staying there too. And I think the student body at St. Michael's basically doubled and more because of these returning GIs, and it was similar at UVM, and in fact at colleges and universities around the country. This new generation is going to have an important effect on changes that are going to take place in Vermont after the war. Certainly Vermont's politics are going to liberalize. Vermont had been a famously Republican state ever since the Republican Party was formed in the 1850s. Vermont had not elected a Democrat as governor since before the Civil War until this man, Philip Hoff, was elected in 1962. Vermont had never had a Democratic senator until Pat Leahy was elected in 1974. But things were changing. Part of the reason for this change was a major Supreme Court decision, Reynolds versus Sims, not widely known today perhaps, but what Reynolds versus Sims did was to democratize state legislative bodies. In the Vermont Constitution, there was a provision that the lower house of the legislature would be represented by one member from every town. In the 18th century, this perhaps made a certain amount of sense because the size of towns was not drastically different from each other. But eventually that changes. Before the Vermont legislature has to change, the representative from Burlington in the Vermont State House was one, and the smallest hamlet in some out-of-the-way corner of Vermont was also one. So there's this very undemocratic kind of political system. That all changes in the 60s. The upshot is that, cities, to the extent Vermont has cities, Burlington, Rutland, for instance, they're going to gain more political power compared with rural parts of the state. This electorate tends to be more liberal. They tend to be more democratic, and this makes it possible for Democrats to begin to make some inroads. Phil Hoff was quite popular in the 60s, often compared to JFK. He was a World War II veteran. He'd been on a submarine in the Pacific during the war. He was handsome. He was also a promoter of human rights, making Vermont a more egalitarian society. He was succeeded by a man who was not part of the greatest generation. Dean C. Davis, who was a Republican, was actually born in 1900. He was old enough to be Phil Hoff's father. But he was a moderate Republican, which is a term we don't hear much about today. Phil Scott is kind of out of the ordinary. He is a more moderate Republican. But traditionally, Vermont, which had kind of a one-party system, had saw the Republicans kind of divided between very conservative people and those who were more moderate. And Dean Davis was one of the more moderate ones. He was also a strong environmentalist and dedicated his 2 terms in the State House as somebody who wanted to protect the environment. One of the important things that Phil Hoff certainly did to promote environmentalism was to back a ban on billboards. The campaign against billboards had been going on for a long time. This particular picture is actually a piece of propaganda used by those opposed to billboards in the 1930s. There were a number of bills that were proposed in the legislature that were voted down over decades. But finally, in 1968, the ban was put into place. There was strong opposition. There was the idea that, it's just un-American to tell somebody how they can use their property. If they want to put a billboard up on their land, that should be their right. There was also the argument that this would confuse tourists. We're trying to attract tourists, but, how are they going to know where to go to get a room to stay or where to eat? That would be a problem. The bill passed because of a compromise the state made by which they put up those little directional signs that we're all familiar with, showing where people could go. And so that was enough to get this bill passed. And it turned out to be a huge plus for tourism. And if you live in Vermont, I guess, you kind of take it for granted there aren't billboards around. But certainly if you're coming from a place, where there are billboards everywhere, it's kind of a shock to drive into Vermont and suddenly no billboards. The scenery isn't being obscured for that reason. Other environmental protections that are being put forward about this time. This is under Davis. You're all familiar with Act 250, passed in 1970. It was a response to the pressure to develop more and more Vermont land. Davis didn't want Vermont to turn into New Jersey. That was always one of the lingering fears that was going to happen. The law set up a quasi-judicial process for deciding whether development could take place. It's always been a controversial law. There have been countless efforts to reform it. Recently it was changed in some significant ways. We're still trying to figure out exactly how that's going to work, but it's certainly been blamed for the lack of affordable housing in the state. It's clear that the law perhaps went too far, but it also helped ensure that Vermont would have the kind of open spaces and scenic vistas that it does have today. And then finally, I wanted to say something about the bottle bill in 1973. It's the reason that we pay to recycle cans and bottles containing beverages. You can get your money back that you have to pay to recycle, but typically most people don't try to get it back, and what happens is the state is supposed to get it for clean water programs. I don't know how successful the bottle bill has been. Some people have always been interested in trying to repeal it. Others want to raise the fee for it, but it's still there. And, it probably makes some difference, although if it had worked as hoped, maybe we wouldn't need something like Green Up Day in the spring. I mean, obviously people are still doing a fair amount of littering. Now, as I said before, if Vermont was going to attract tourists as a way of reviving the economy, they're going to have to do something about roads. In 1958, the Interstate Highway Act would be passed under the Eisenhower administration. The impetus behind this act was the Senate Majority Leader, future President Lyndon Johnson. Now, Johnson was a master political operator. One of the ways he got this bill passed was by ensuring that he'd get support from every senator and congressman by mandating that every state in the country, whether they needed it or not, was going to get an interstate highway. And I've been in Hawaii and on Oahu, driving on their interstate highway, and it seems kind of unnecessary, but it's there. And of course, Vermont is going to get some too. By this point, I think Vermonters had reached the stage where they didn't want to reject federal money. They wanted to improve their infrastructure. The decision is made, we're not going to build a big highway on the spine of the Green Mountains. We're going to put these highways in places where it'll be more politically palatable, in river valleys. So I-91 be built along the Connecticut River Valley, I-89 largely along the Winooski River Valley. On the left, you can see a picture of some of the early construction on I-91. When we talk about the building of these interstates, I wanted to say a word about Romain Tenney. Are any of you familiar with him? Okay. Well, I'll maybe not enlighten you, but maybe some other people. Romain Tenney was a 64-year-old farmer when land along the right-of-way for I-91 was being condemned. He'd lived on this land all his life. He'd farmed it all his life. He tried to fight to keep it, but he lost the legal battles. And although his neighbors reluctantly were selling their land and leaving, Romain Tenney simply couldn't bear the idea of that happening. And so just before he was physically evicted from his farm, he set fire to his barn. This is after he released his animals. Set fire to his house, nailed the door shut to his bedroom, and shot himself. This is a tragedy, obviously. But I think for most people, you know, you can feel bad that this happened, and yet feel that, well, this is progress. This is what has to happen if we're going to progress as a community, as a state. We needed this highway to be built. But it also is a sign of what has been lost. Vermont certainly has changed. The old Vermont is disappearing. Romain Tenney could not live with the thought that he couldn't stay on this land. During this period, Vermont is also getting a first-class airport. It would take a long time. First planes coming into Vermont tended to land on the parade ground at 40th and Allen. If you've driven by the fort on Route 15, you'll notice that big park there. Colchester and Essex Junction now use it as a park, and you'll see kids playing sports there during the fall and spring. In the 1920s, the mail plane to the Burlington area would come in and land in that spot, in that parade ground. It's hardly an ideal place for a landing strip. You're just landing on grass, and if the weather was bad, and I think in the winter the mail was obviously going to be delayed. By the 1930s, they began to put together what eventually becomes the airport that we know, the Burlington Airport. It's in South Burlington. It's called the Burlington Airport. The picture here is from a postcard in the 1940s, showing what the airport looked at about that time. Okay. Winding up. Anyway, one last thing that I wanted to mention was the way that Vermont was promoting itself. State legislature created the Vermont Life magazine, 1947. And this actually was, I think, a fairly effective way of telling people about Vermont in a very positive way, getting them to come here, and basically contrasting Vermont in a very positive way with the outside world, which wasn't that positive. You wanted to get away from it. Vermont could be a kind of respite. And I think it was something that was passed out to tourists, mailed to them, and was very important in encouraging tourists. I'm not going to say too much about skiing, but obviously we all know the development of the skiing industry. Pioneering work in Stowe is going to be a very important stimulus for tourism into Vermont. And just two more things. The story is that Tom Watson Jr., the head of IBM, was a ski enthusiast who started going to Stowe in the 1940s, liked it so much, was so impressed with the work ethic of the people, that he decided that because he needed to site a new facility to manufacture computer chips, that he was going to put it in Vermont, which he did. And his love for Stowe and skiing there was so well known that he ends up with his family on the cover of Sports Illustrated. As you probably know, IBM, beginning in the 1950s, quickly becomes the largest employer in the entire state, and it realizes Dorothy Canfield Fisher's dream of bringing educated white-collar employees into the state to improve the economy, to grow it. And then I'll end on this. IDX is here in part because of IBM. You may be familiar with the stories of Robert Hale and Richard Tarrant, who first came to St. Michael's in the early 1960s to play basketball. And they had very successful teams. They ended up in the small college Final Four. When they graduated with degrees in math, they went to work for IBM. They were marketing reps. But soon they left to form their own company, which comes to be known as IDX. And I think it's a good symbol of the kind of synergy that takes place because of people interested in being here for one reason or another, often something related to the environment. They stay here, they create businesses here, they create jobs here. And certainly this is a key to helping to grow the economy and make Vermont into the kind of iconic place that it becomes. So I could keep going on for probably another hour or so, but let's stop there. And if you have any questions, I can make an effort to try to answer them.
So Doug, I know you had two more slides. You want to briefly show them?
Well, not really.
Okay.
One of them, I'll just say, one of them just lists some places that, since the late.
Because it brings us to the modern time period. To all things that everyone in this room can definitely relate to.
These are all things that have helped make Vermont a tourist destination. The last one is really just kind of a downer. I don't know if you want to see it, but in the last few years, we're well aware that Vermont has certainly had some problems. And Vermont's pristine image has taken a few hits in the last few years. And I think we all wonder, well, are we going to sort of transcend this? Are we going to be able to make things better? I remember, during COVID, my wife and I didn't go down to downtown Burlington to Church Street for a couple of years, actually. And we did go down. We started noticing all this graffiti on everything. And there was that huge hole in the ground, where the indoor mall had been. Church Street is still a pretty vibrant place. It's not quite as nice as it was, say, 30 years ago. But my feeling, certainly from putting this talk together, was that, Vermont has changed in a lot of positive ways. And it's because we've had people here who were not just brave, like Calvin Coolidge said we were, and we are, but people who were dreamers, people who had ideas, and they had the energy to try to put them into effect. And so I have hope that Vermont is going to get into a better place over time, that we shouldn't get too depressed about the way things are, that there are always going to be problems. But I do feel like we do have the resources to make the best of things and to improve. Yeah.
Doug, it's not a business and it's not an attraction, but what role do you think Bernie has played in sort of Vermont's sort of panache and reputation?
Well, Bernie was mayor when the waterfront development was happening. And certainly, you know, there was big pressure just to sell this land off to private developers and put up hotels or even private homes down there. And the fact that we have this wonderful public space with the Eco Center and the boathouse and the bike path, you know, if that wasn't there, Burlington certainly wouldn't be as beautiful and vibrant a place as it is, and that was certainly one of his contributions. Yeah.
I think a really important item as far as Vermont identity was the same-sex union and marriage laws that came about in Vermont, that it just people who wanted a place to go, to feel, to have a commitment, to feel welcome, you know, they came to Vermont, and I think a lot of people took that as like a keyword, you know, that, oh, crunchy granola, Vermont, liberal, you know, like all of Vermont then became synonymous with a lot of things that, you know, in 20th century history, that kind of cemented a certain view of it, even though historically it had these, you know, very important, simple, rugged kinds of backstory. You know what I mean? Like, just that brought it into the 21st century.
I want to do what John was telling me to do before this and try to repeat comments so that everybody will know. Really, a comment from you more than a question about how Vermont has changed, and the kind of conservative values, traditional values that Vermont was known for have become rather different. The civil union debate was an example of that. Electing somebody like Bernie Sanders, who's a self-described socialist, is another example. I thought somebody would probably ask me something about how, you know, hippies coming to Vermont in the 1970s had changed everything. And there is an element of that, although I don't think they had that much political power. Bernie Sanders, by the way, was one of those hippies, in a sense. Yeah, Vermont's known for being very liberal politically, being open to you know, ideas that many parts of the country are not ready for. The example of Bernie Sanders is really pretty interesting, though. Some of you may remember, you know, he first came to Vermont, I think in the 1970s, and he almost immediately started running for office, state legislature, representative or something. And over again he lost. He was the Liberty Union candidate a number of times, and you'd have thought this guy is going nowhere. But he persisted, and that's been one of the great things about Bernie. He does not give up. What is he, 85 years old? He's had a heart attack. He's still there. You can see him on TV almost every night, plugging his causes. And I think even many people who don't agree with him on a lot of issues have voted for him just because they like him as an irritant, somebody who's going to force people to look at things in a different kind of way. And I think Vermonters in some ways pride themselves on
Being the irritant?
well, here we are. You know, we may not dress pretty. We may wear bean boots to formal events and flannel shirts and elbow patches.
That's your puffer.
Yeah.
Puffer coat.
I love the individual. I almost feel like it's, you know, Ethan Allen questioned for the 14th state, and there are people that were against it. You know, of course, somebody like George Washington said, let's do it, let's add a state. And I just love that independence, and I see that in some of the things that have been interesting, you know, taking place. The first to allow a black to go to college, you know, the first state. You know, a fella took the first cross-country road trip. A guy took a car from San Francisco to New York, he's from Vermont. You know, I don't know, 1920s or something, you know.
He was a doctor from Burlington.
Okay, all right,
He lived on Main Street.
yeah. What is it, first women to get a vote?
There were western states that got the vote first.
Oh, Montana did. Montana did. Wyoming. Wyoming, all right, okay. All right, but, you know, there's some interesting individual things that have taken place, and I think you see that, you know, sure, I could go to Iowa, or I could go to your state, I could go to Minnesota, there's probably something unique there too, but I just find it's kind of very interesting. I almost feel like it's something that Ethan Allen kind of suggested. Anyway.
It's really tangential to what we're talking about, but Vermont as an icon shows up in Japan. When I visited there and said I was from Vermont, people immediately said, Vermont curry. A very popular comfort food was Vermont curry, made with honey and apples. And that's what people knew about Vermont. And that
A quintessential Vermont food. As long as it's got maple syrup, it's okay.
You actually opened the door to my question, so one thing about Vermont is that obviously we export the fact that we have maple, and so we have to the point where Vermont has its own standard of grading maple syrup. So earlier you alluded to like one species of tree, the sugar maple, being spared in the logging stuff. When did Vermont start realizing, let's try marketing this outside of, let's try making it a thing and try to put fake syrups out of business?
I don't know when it started exactly. I know that certainly by the time I got here in the 1980s, it was happening, and companies were being sued for, you know, being out of state and producing something that they called Vermont made. So that's certainly an important part of the story. We're very protective of our brand. Vermont has become literally a brand in a way that few states actually are. People hear the word Vermont and they think, you know, it must be better quality, it must be pure, it's not going to make me sick if I eat it. That's not always true, but you know, that's what we want to think, what people want to think. It certainly has been an important way of promoting the idea of Vermont as a unique place.
Two questions. One is, in movies and televisions, there have been jokes about Vermont, and one of my questions is, now, how does the rest of the country view Vermont? And secondly, I went to Utah State University and completed my master's thesis on a suburban sprawl prediction for Chittenden County, Vermont. And I wondered how you think Vermont's going to fare in the next 10, 20 years.
Well, this is about kind of attitudes about Vermont and how Vermont uses its land, our land use patterns. I think we, you know, in some ways are ahead of the curve in at least being conscious of trying to preserve open spaces. A lot of places basically have given up. In Vermont, we've created problems for ourselves with housing, with the regulations that are needed to, you need to meet in order to build new developments. And certainly, you know, outsiders, I think, can look askance like, you know, these people have these weird ideas, and instead of just sort of, you know, thinking about them and discarding them like normal people would, they actually try to put them into practice. And they're so impractical. And some ideas may be impractical, but I think the consequence has been that we have largely protected our environment in a way that many states have not, have continued to make Vermont an attractive place to go to. And I think, you know, with climate change and with growing demands on our resources, it would seem logical that eventually Vermont is going to be a place that people are going to want to come to even more, maybe to escape other things. Unfortunately, we learned with our flooding that Vermont is not disaster-proof. We can still have disasters as well, although maybe not quite as bad as many other places. So I think it's a good thing to try to preserve Vermont's image. People may make fun of it, but they may be coming here eventually to escape the problems where they live. Yeah.
To your maple sugaring point, local author Willard Stern Randall would tell you in his book, Forgotten Americans, that we have Thomas Jefferson to thank for the maple sugar industry. He and James Madison got in a coach during the recess of Congress in 1789 or 1790, whatever year it was. They came up to cannonball through New England for as long as they could go before Congress reconvened in Philadelphia. And they came up here, and of course, Thomas Jefferson, how he ended up in a book called Forgotten Americans is, God only knows that. But he being the naturalist and monumental man that he is, and so well versed in everything, Renaissance man, he had heard about maple syrup, maple sugaring, that the Vermont white natives had learned from the true natives of Vermont, and he thought that it could be used against the British. That because we drank so much tea, just like the Brits, that we imported, famously, Boston Tea Party, all that stuff, we also paid very high taxes and very high prices for sugar. And he thought the maple industry could be developed to provide a sweetener for tea as an alternative to the high-priced and highly taxed imported sugar from Britain.
Yeah, this is in regard to Thomas Jefferson's role in promoting the maple syrup industry. It is true that he and Madison did come up to New England. There's some dispute as to whether he actually got to Vermont or stayed here very long. But if you go down to Chimney Point on the lake across from Crown Point, right by the Champlain Bridge, there's a little museum there where allegedly Madison and Jefferson stayed when they came across the lake to Vermont.
Doug, there are numerous hands still up, but we are already 15 minutes over time. So I was wondering if you would be willing to stick around so that those who still have questions would be able to come up and chat with you a little bit more still?
Sure.
Okay, fabulous. Could everyone please help me thanking Just want to make sure I say this in the mic so that TV can pick it up. I also forgot to thank CCTV for recording this program. So thank you, Charlie and Town Meeting TV. And also thank you to Leah and Chris up here in the front row who provided the wonderful refreshments today as well. So please take some refreshments on your way out the door. And just one last reminder, it's my job as the director to remind you to help support the Homestead as you can. It is the season of giving. There are membership forms at the front desk. There's a donation box on your way out the door. And please let me know if you'd like to be added to our fundraising mailing list as well. Thank you all so much for coming today.